If you're just getting into game development and you're wondering how to move your character, this tutorial is just for you. By the end of this video, here is what you will have accomplished. Before we get started, there are a few disclaimers I want to mention to make sure you're on the right video. This video will cover 3D movement, so if you're working on a 2D project, there might be a few differences. The depth of the movement will be quite simple in this video, so there won't be any high-level movements such as dashing or jumping or crouching, and there also won't be any character animation. In order for you to keep up with this tutorial, there are a few concepts that you should know before watching this. First of all, you should have knowledge in the programming basics, so if you know about variables and methods, you're all covered. You should also have an understanding of 3D vectors, since they will be used a lot, and you should have Unity and Visual Studio installed. Before we are able to make our character move, we will first have to set up the necessary physical objects in our scene, which are called game objects. You will then learn how to move your character with the arrow keys by directly moving the character's position, and finally, you will learn how to rotate the player's view using your mouse. Once you have your project set up, you will want to create two game objects, the first one being your player and the second one being the ground which it's going to move on. To create a game object, you will want to go in the hierarchy, right-click, go to 3D object, and create a cube. We can rename this to player. We'll then want to create our ground, so do the same thing, and just add a plane. Resize the plane by clicking on it and pressing R and scaling it to your liking, and move the cube up by pressing W on it and dragging it up. To add a material, right-click in your assets, go to Create, Material, change its albedo at the top right in the inspector to say green, and then drag and drop it onto the plane. Next, we're going to want to create a new script for our player. So to do so, press on your player, go to Add Component, search for Script, New Script, and give it a name. I'm going to call it Character Movement. Alright, so that created a new script. We can see so in our assets, just double click on it and it will open it on Visual Studio. Once your Visual Studio project is open, start by creating the necessary variables. So we're going to need two private 3D vectors, horizontal movement and vertical movement, which will detect the player's desired movement direction. And we'll also need a public float called movement speed, which will let us adjust how fast the player moves. Notice how if you go to your inspector on the player's components, the movement speed is modifiable here, since it has been set public. Next, in the update method, we will first want to assign the horizontal movement vector to the horizontal input. Since we want our A and D arrow keys to move the player sideways, multiply the keyboard's input by transform.right, which is value always represents the vector to the player's right no matter its rotation. You should use the transform component whenever you want to access and modify the player's rotation and position. Next, assign the vertical movement to the vertical input, and multiply by a new vector only containing the x and z values of the transform.forward, which always represents the direction the player is facing. We're omitting the y value to avoid vertical movement. Now add those two vectors up and increment the player's transform.position by the direction multiplied by the movement speed and the time elapsed since the last frame. Great, now make sure your movement speed isn't 0, and you have a moving character. We're now going to make our player rotate with our mouse, so first declare the horizontal mouse movement flow variable, declare the public sensitivity variable which will allow us to adjust it, and declare a quaternion, which is an orientation vector, which stores the player's current rotation. Then initialize the current rotation to GameObject transform rotation, which contains the player's initial rotation, and set the cursor to invisible. Then assign the mouse's input to the mouse x axis, and multiply it by the mouse's sensitivity. Make sure the string is capitalized since it is case sensitive. Finally, increment the current rotation's y parameter and set the player's rotation to the new y rotation. With our code ready, all that's left to do is to set our camera as a child of our player in order for it to inherit its movement. To do so, just drag and drop the main camera onto the player, and readjust it to an angle that you like by looking at the given preview. And there you have it. Don't forget to change your mouse sensitivity, set it to 2 for instance, and you have a moving character.